All right, guys. So this will be the last lecture for POSC 201. It's December 2nd. As is par for the course, record these for my Monday, Wednesday class, and then actually post them also for my Tuesday, Thursday class. So Tuesday, Thursday class, if you're watching this, it may actually be December 3rd. But it's December 2nd as of today. And I just wanted to have that last little lecture. And if you'll note on the Moodle sections, it's over the 14th Amendment. We do incorporate the 14th Amendment. It's a big deal in kind of bending the Constitution to the opportunity for judicial activism while staying in the boundaries of originalism. And because there is language in the 14th Amendment that allows for interpretation and application of the words as written, though maybe not intended. And I know that originalism really falls upon the intent of those who wrote the laws. But the argument, of course, is that as written, had the framers wanted specific cutouts in the 14th Amendment, they would have included those. I think the 9th Amendment applies to that. The 9th Amendment was really never amended, but remember the 14th Amendment comes after the 9th and the 10th Amendments, and so one might argue that those were amending the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. At any rate, so the 14th Amendment is important as we think about constitutional republic and the application of law and the roles of both the national government and the state, and the idea that the Constitution is supreme, the supremacy clause, and thereby the decisions of the courts then regarding that Constitution and how state or any government in the Union can operate really falls to their interpretation, giving the court so much power. So, but I do want to talk about the unconstitutional 14th Amendment, unconstitutional not in what it does, what it says, and how it's applied necessarily today, but actually how it came about. And to do that, we got to get into the times. And of course, context gives us a good interpretation of the content that we're reading, a proper interpretation of the content that we're reading, if we're going to try to get into the heads of those individuals who actually wrote the laws, who wrote the Constitution. So if we're going to practice originalism and we're going to hang on the intent, then we want to know what was going on at the time to give context to the words that were used as the Constitution was amended and or written. So, of course, the Civil War, right? So the Civil War is over the issue of slavery, and I think we should make that clear. But the issue of slavery is not an island, right? It doesn't sit by itself. It wasn't just like, hey, we have a problem with slavery, now let's separate ourselves from the rest of the Union. It was more than just slavery. Slavery was the issue, but what is slavery? What was slavery? What did slavery mean to the South? What did slavery not mean to the North? What did it mean in terms of human rights versus states' rights or economic rights? Those were all the issues, but it's more than just the issue of slavery. It really falls down to the issue of what was in the Constitution and what was the power of the state then to exercise rather than the national government or the collective of states to impress upon the others, right? So we had certain states that were not slave states, and as states came into the Union, remember, they came in basically 2 by 2. Michigan came in with Arkansas, a free state and a slave state. And there were different congressional acts throughout the time after the inception of the Constitution up into the Civil War that attempted to stave off the Civil War and that issue of slavery, which was an issue from the inception of the ratification of the Constitution all the way up into the Civil War. Those who found it repugnant and were against it and were working every day to eliminate it, eradicate it, and those individuals who believed that the institution of slavery was a historical institution. Slavery had been around for forever, right? For those of you who are religious, pull out your good book, go back to the Old Testament, right? The slaveries and the slaves, the Israelites, the Pharaoh in Egypt. Slavery from the dawn of written history had been in existence. And so this was just wasn't created by the West. It wasn't created by the United States. It was an institution that had existed really, again, since written history. And this was a continuation, and it was used as an economic tool, right? Slave labor. The slave labor and that labor was meant to both benefit individual slaveholders, both economically and leisurely, right? A cushier life, a life where they themselves do not have to toil as much, but for the ownership of property, quote unquote, to do the things, the menial tasks that they themselves would have to do or pay somebody else to do ultimately. And so slavery was an issue, but it was economics, it was history, and it was states' rights. Who had the moral superiority to come and to tell an individual group or a group of individuals that they could or couldn't do something? Certainly, obviously, as we look at it from history, the history is on the side of those individuals who were opposed to slavery. It was repugnant. It is repugnant, and it should have been eradicated. But the question is not our 2020 sensibilities. The question is our 1860s sensibilities and this culmination of slavery that had existed, right, for all time, all the way up into that point. And the South arguing that as far as the role of government, this institution of our federal system of government went, that was not an issue for the national government because it wasn't in the Constitution that it wasn't okay. And it wasn't in the Constitution that the national government would have the authority to end slavery or to hamper the economic rights of the states in that manner. That was the argument, certainly, of the South. So we have states' rights versus human rights. And the issue of slavery, right? The issue of slavery from the inception of the ratification of the Constitution. And you can see woven into the Constitution, there's language, numeration that protects slavery at least to 1808, right? The 20 years rule. And then allows for the importation of slave and recognizes that different laws shall not hamper that importation. And so though there's kind of an end game, right? So I think you have a recognition that after 1808, Congress can begin to deal with importation laws, commerce, right? The Commerce Clause. But at the same time, the institution of slavery that was already going on within the states, there was no obvious language, enumerated language, or even readily implied language that would allow for the federal or national government to end slavery in the separate states. That, of course, hinged on the 10th Amendment, right? The states wanted, right, for ratification purposes, that those things not in the Constitution shall be left for the states to decide. Now, you have in the Constitution the necessary and proper clause. Now, I remind students and anybody who will listen, the 10th Amendment comes after the ratification of the Constitution. That's why it's an amendment. The elastic or necessary and proper clause was in the Constitution. That's what the states read, and that's where the hang-up came that required a 10th Amendment. They read the necessary and proper clause. They recognized what its potential was, that it could expand or stretch the Constitution into areas it wasn't meant to go. And so the 10th Amendment was a way to pull that back in, that the Constitution says what it says and it means what it says. And that was a condition of ratification for a number of states, necessary to get to 9, let alone all 13 states eventually. So the 10th Amendment was added to address the necessary and proper clause. Now, when we get to McCulloch versus Maryland, Marshall rewrites that history and puts the elastic and necessary and proper clause back ahead of the 10th Amendment. So I'm not sure what the 10th Amendment actually amended, because the necessary and proper clause really allows for the Constitution, at least the national government, the Constitution, the national powers, or state powers, but certainly the national government, to grow, because that's what's created, right? We empower the national government out of the Constitution. When the Constitution is ratified, we create a federal system of government and we empower the national government. So the necessary and proper clause, again, it is on one end, right, for those individuals who are looking to the Constitution to point to where states' rights and the 10th Amendment doesn't uphold, okay, doesn't hold, and then using the Commerce Clause as well as other clauses, the Commerce Clause, to argue that as an issue of commerce, right, the institution of slavery and importation laws, that they all fall under the purview of the national government. At the same time, however, the states were arguing that yes, but the Constitution must pass laws that don't specifically damage some states and benefit other states, that the laws that come from Congress must have the general welfare of the United States in mind, that they can't necessarily pit states against one another. All right, well, that kind of runs counter to the whole idea of Commerce Clause. So, for example, if you're a milk farmer, if you're familiar with the Eau Claire rule, at one point in time, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, was kind of the center of the dairy world. And the further you got from Eau Claire, the lower the subsidies, federal subsidies, the lower the assistance anyway from the federal government, which would seem to run counter to the idea of the general welfare clause. So the issue of slavery as commerce and economics, you've got these two different areas in the Constitution, which should have equal merit, being argued by both sides. And of course, then the 9th Amendment, which we always couple with the 10th Amendment, but the 9th Amendment arguing that we're not going to misconstrue or construe things that are in or not in the Constitution as powers of the national government differently than what was intended by the authors. So then we get over this issue of slavery as we recognize that the North and the Republican Party is born which is an interesting term, Republican Party, but it has its roots within the Democrat Republicans, the old party of Jefferson and those of Monroe and Madison, which were called the Democrat Republicans or just Republicans. And then we had that party of the Federalists, which continued beyond the Democrat Republicans, and you had the Whigs, and ultimately the Democrat Party is born with Andrew Jackson, as we had discussed earlier in class. But the Republican Party's platform, right, in the 1850s, right, just prior to the Civil War, the Republican Party's platform was all about the ending of slavery. And as more states sent representatives, senators, congressmen to Washington, D.C., to fight as Republicans, right, with the goal of fighting slavery, and then, of course, with the election of Lincoln, the writing was on the wall as to what the intent, the written, the stated intent of those elected officials was going to be, and that's recognizing all of these issues, the erosion of the institution of slavery. This is where the South secedes. They declare that the Constitution is null and void, right? That it's not living up to what was the agreement signed as a contract, right? The Constitution is a contract, and therefore the contract is null and void. All right. When Lincoln comes in, he says, whoa, wait a second. There's been no abridgment of this contract, right? We're not out of the national government and the states. They're not out of this contract because no party has worked outside of the contract. Yes, the Republican Party is going to work to end slavery. However, that's a process that will work within the Constitution, within the contract. That's, of course, the argument. The South doesn't see it that way. The South sees a party that's hell-bent specifically on ending their state's rights to the institution of slavery, and they see that then as fracturing the Constitution, and therefore the Constitution is null and void. And when the Constitution becomes null and void, those southern states that supported slavery, they form the Confederate States government, right? So the Confederacy or confederal system, right, was the system that predated the federal system, predated the ratification of the Constitution. So the unitary system under England, then the confederal system, right, under the Articles of Confederation, where the states were separate and sovereign and the national government really had no power. And then you had the national government that came in and, sorry. Yeah, the national government that came in and shared power in that federal system. Well, breaking that shared power, right, null and void, the Constitution created that shared power, breaking that then leads back to our confederal system. The states assume their sovereignty and then enter into an agreement with a Confederate Congress and a Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, and have their own Constitution. And actually, the Southern states, the Confederate Constitution, is just the rewrite of our federal Constitution, the national Constitution, but for two very stark, specific changes. One is that slavery will be perpetuated and a state right writ large in that Constitution, that Southern states Constitution. So the issue of slavery, clearly a reason for the separation and ultimately the Civil War. But the second blatant change to this Constitution is that there will be no elastic clause, no necessary and proper clause, that the 10th Amendment, as was intended by the states, right, allowed the states the power to do anything that was not in the Constitution, and that the national government could only do those things in the Constitution. So the Southern Constitution that comes, it's a rewrite of the federal Constitution, to almost word for word, except for slavery as a state right and no necessary and proper clause, right? So when we come to what are the issues that lend themselves to the Civil War, it's slavery, yes, but in the context of the necessary and proper clause, which gave, in the minds of the states, the national government too much power. We get into the banking issue. We get into other issues, right? Under the Federalist, John Marshall, Federalist Nationalist John Marshall, strengthening the national government to the chagrin of the states. That leads to, in the minds of the states, a legitimate reason for secession and the establishment of the Confederate States of America. Well, there was no abridgment. If there's no abridgment, secession, no, you cannot secede, right? You're still attached to this Constitution. In fact, the North made that argument. There's been no abridgment. So the contract is still intact. In other words, you are still a part of this Constitution. The Constitution still applies to you. You are states of the Union, the national government in areas, right, where the national government is supreme, still holds control over you. So issues of dealing with foreign countries, like common currency, economic issues, those are all still in place. And the South said, no. The state elected leaders, our state elected leaders, made these decisions. The North said they're not state elected leaders. These are traitors to the Constitution. They swore an oath, right? The Constitution has the oath that when you're elected, you swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. All right, so you have those two things at play. However, the Constitution also includes, right, that a Republican form of government shall be guaranteed. In other words, you have the right to elect the people to represent you based upon your interests, based upon your district, to make decisions of government, to make government decisions. Remember, government decides who gets what. So you have the right to choose the individuals who will be making those decisions on your behalf. A representative democracy, a Republican form of government, Democrat Republicans, right? So this idea that this Republican Party is chosen as the moniker, but at the same time, we've got state elected leaders, particularly from the South, who are making decisions on behalf of their citizens, duly elected, right? They're not dictators and despots. They're duly elected, yet they're traitors because they're not upholding the Constitution that these individuals from their states do not believe is representing their state's interests or benefiting their states, as was agreed to in the Constitution. So this then becomes the foundation of the Civil War. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, that's a great question, because I think you can see the argument is there on both sides. Those individuals who, again, were hell-bent on getting rid of slavery, using the Constitution to do that, but believing that the Constitution has not ended slavery, because it hadn't to this point, seeing the South seceding, breaking apart this union unilaterally, right? And then doing so based upon what their interest, but this all then falls within states' rights, the state's interest and the right of the states that created this national government to walk away from it if it felt it was necessary to do so. That's the Civil War. So let's take the issue of slavery out. Now, again, I don't think you can take the issue of slavery out of the Civil War, because whatever the issue is, it would pale in comparison to slavery. But if it was over the importation of cheap cotton, or something to that effect, which would negatively affect the South disproportionately to the North, and the North was making decisions regarding the importation, which was in the Constitution, but clearly negatively impacting the South. And if the South made the argument that this is not the Constitution, or great, we didn't agree to this relationship where, right, some states were going to be negatively affected, general welfare, and other states were going to benefit from this, and we're the ones who are getting shafted. We didn't agree to that, and I'm not going to uphold our half of this agreement when it's not coming, to fruition the way that it was presented. So if you were to enter into a contract to have somebody paint your house, and that individual took the paint and then slapped the paint all over the place, right? You would have to look at that and go, okay, did this individual paint the house? Okay, yeah, they painted the house, but is this what was pitched, right? Did the individual come and say, yes, I'm going to paint the house, I'm not going to finish it, it's not going to look good, I'm going to slap it onto your windows? If they didn't present that as being what you were paying for, why would you pay for a shoddy job? Well, the flip side to that argument is I painted the house, right? This is all we discussed. I came out, I gave up my time, I came and I spent time on this house, and the house has paint on it, the house is painted. This is a contractual fight. Who's right in that situation? Well, it depends. Are you the painter or the homeowner? Right? So the Civil War comes to a head, and I think both sides have a good argument, though it's hard to get past this issue of slavery in terms of what side you'd want to be on. I think all of us, in retrospect, right, historical relativism, go, hey, we would be on the side of the North on this. But the argument is still here, and there's legitimacy to this argument. And this is what then leads into the writing, that piece that's in the session, the Moodle session on the unconstitutional 14th Amendment. This sets the stage for the Civil War. The Civil War is fought. The South loses. The North beats the South into submission. Now, when the South leaves, again, history often is written by the victors, right? When the South leaves, one of the things that the South does is they want their property, and Fort Sumter is seen as the property of South Carolina, and the federal government is not going to give it up. South Carolina wants the fort. The federal government, rather than give them the fort, sends troops to fortify it. That is seen as aggressive or aggression by the federal government towards the state of South Carolina, and South Carolina fires on those ships and then fires on Fort Sumter, which would be the first shots of the Civil War. However, again, there's an argument to be made regarding whose island was that? Given the separation, right? Given the fact that the South is saying we are no longer a part of the North, does the national government have rights to those properties that were once federal or national properties? At any rate, the shots are fired. There's justification then for invasion, and the North invades the South. You know, Southerners don't call it the Civil War; they call it the War of Northern Aggression, because the North goes into the South and then beats the South into submission. And in that process of beating the South into submission, as we're getting towards the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment is ratified properly. The 13th Amendment is ratified via the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution never went anywhere. There was no abridgment, right? You could not secede, right? And so the Constitution is in place. The proper process for then amending the Constitution, since the South could not secede, is to follow Article 5. Article 5 of the Constitution allows Congress, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, to present back to the states, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify the Constitution. That happened. The Constitution, Article 5, process of amending the Constitution, gives us the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment ends slavery. Civil War comes to an end. The 13th Amendment is passed. Slavery is done. It's gone. Okay? Crowning achievement of our president, President Lincoln at the time, to get the South on board with this. So the end of slavery, no more slavery, no more need for the separation. The Union is whole. Constitution was never broken. Okay? Well, we still have this Republican form of government in place. And the Southern states elect the leaders to represent them, duly elected leaders to represent them. And locally, and I'd have to take a check to see if these were also state laws, but by state laws, but certainly locally, different ordinances were passed that really retained slavery. It wasn't called slavery, but arose by any other name. And in this case, the thorns of the rose was keeping slavery intact. You had what were called apprentice laws, where individuals who didn't have jobs, because remember, these newly freed slaves, if we go back to the Taney decision, they're still not citizens. They're citizens of nothing, at least as far as the federal government is concerned. So only the states can determine what the rights are of these individuals, because there's no national rights. There's no national rights, no constitutional rights, U.S. constitutional rights, given the Dred Scott decision for these newly freed slaves. So they're kind of they're in this gray area. They're not slaves. They're not property. Of course, they're human beings. They're not property, but they're not afforded the rights of a citizen yet. And as such, local ordinances, maybe even state laws, were passing laws. States and localities were passing laws and passing ordinances that really kept slavery intact, even though it was no longer called slavery. If you didn't have a job, and who would? If you were a newly freed slave, then you had to have a job. And if you had no skills, you had to take on an apprenticeship. Apprenticeships are often not paid, and oftentimes would put you right back in the fields doing what you were doing before, or in the house doing what you were doing before. And again, you forced into those apprenticeships. This, as it should, right, incenses those individuals, those Republicans who were fighting to do away with slavery, not just in name, but in practice. And the Southern government, surrendering to the North, reincorporating themselves into the Union. And then with the passage of the 13th Amendment, doing away with involuntary servitude, are not They may be holding to the letter, but certainly not the spirit of this 13th Amendment. This is where the occupation comes. This is where the 14th Amendment comes. The 15th Amendment comes. This is where the rebuilding of the reconstruction of the South is taking place. The Reconstruction Acts, and as conditions of being let back into the Union, though they can never leave, the 14th and the 15th Amendments had to be passed. Now, the 14th Amendment's the big one. Now, in a reading of the 14th Amendment in context to everything we just talked about, including the 13th Amendment and the failure of the states and or local governments to actually apply the undoing of slavery to these individuals as human beings, extending the same rights to these individuals as they were extended to any citizen of those states or those local localities. The 14th Amendment makes perfect sense as written. All right, so there are five sections to your 14th Amendment. And in that writing of the 14th Amendment, you're going to see there's a question on your final. How many sections are there of the 14th Amendment? The answer is 5. And in that writing, they all bend back to what we just talked about. So if we pull these up. So the first section, section 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So here we get a couple of kind of dangling questions answered. One was after the Dred Scott case, right? The Taney decision, Dred Scott case. That court declared that blacks were not and were never intended to be citizens of the United States, right? The states themselves could make that determination as to citizen rights or free man's rights, but the Constitution is mum. It doesn't say anything. In fact, with the importation of slaves and slavery, it was more likely that the Constitution created a separation of who were citizens and who were not citizens versus language that would incorporate all individuals as being citizens. Well, this takes care of that, right? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, that's important, right, are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. All right, so both the state where they reside and the United States as well. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So the rights you have as a citizen of the United States, no state, singular, can abridge those or break those rights or not give you those rights, right? Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Now, wait a second, due process of the law, nor shall any state deprive it. But we saw due process of the law, right? The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution addresses due process of the law. Well, this is a great lesson in pointing out the fact that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they were to be applied to the national government. Conditions placed upon the national government to protect the states and the individuals within the states from a national government running rogue or roughshod like the English government did leading up to the American Revolution. And so as the national government had to get a warrant and had to hold an individual, to try an individual, all of those steps that of due process must be applied by the national government to any citizen. But states didn't necessarily have to, because again, this didn't apply, the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. Here we take care of that. Right? States 2, also cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, right? Nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So a person that's within that state's jurisdiction could not be denied the equal protection of the laws. So we have newly freed slaves, right? Individuals who were not citizens, but were not slaves, right? These persons cannot be denied equal protection of the law. All right. And this is any person, by the way. So, and not just citizens. These individuals are now citizens. We take care of that by, of course, 1808. There's no more importation of slaves. So one would assume then, right, even though there was still importation of slaves, but one would assume that any individual who was a slave was born in the United States or naturalized, right, in the United States. They are now citizens with citizens' rights. That's Article 1. That's the big one. And the big part of that is, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's where we begin to get into issues regarding gay marriage and the rights of individuals, minority groups, minority rights, all of those being fitting within the this idea of a person within its jurisdiction being denied the equal protection of the laws. You can't have one set of laws for one group of individuals and a second set for another. Was that the intent of the 14th Amendment? I think it was certainly geared towards the issue of slavery and what we were describing, but that's been its interpretation since, and it has really opened that 14th Amendment up. And I will say, if we go with some of the current controversies, if you were to look at the election, one of the claims made by the Trump team, particularly in, I think it was Pennsylvania, it was thrown out, but the point is that it says a 14th Amendment violation, and that was in certain counties in the state of Pennsylvania, and this may also have been true in Georgia. In certain counties in Pennsylvania, you could fix your ballot if you made an error. In other words, the government within the state, right, those localities within the state, they would go after individuals and say, hey, you screwed your ballot up, you're going to want to re-vote. But in other counties in the state, that was not a practice. In fact, the individuals were denied from, quote unquote, curing their votes. So there's an argument that those individuals who weren't allowed the opportunity to cure their votes while others were, that you have two systems there of law, and one group was being denied, more often Republicans, and one group was being allowed, more often Democrats, or the urban areas versus the rural areas. And that was an argument that was made, and the court ultimately said, well, it has no merit. Not only it has merit, for sure it has merit. It's an argument that needs to be addressed. The problem is, if you address it, you're either going to uphold, right, that these individuals who weren't allowed to cure their ballots, fix their ballots, were denied their right. But in doing so, you're going to tell these individuals who fixed their ballots that their votes don't count. And who wants to be in that position to have to make that decision, right? But the argument, of course, from the Trump campaign has been since the end of the election that we want every legal vote to count. The question is, are those legal votes or aren't they legal votes? Curing ballots after the fact. I think it warrants the court to take a look at. And I think that one is actually making its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the proper, it would end up there either way, whether the lower courts found in favor of Giuliani and Trump, or found in favor of the defendants, which are really the canvassers, the Secretary of State, right, state officials. Section 2, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, right, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote at an election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive judicial offices of the state, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such a state being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged except for the participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. Now, this becomes important when we get into the voting rights, which comes after the 15th Amendment, not the 14th Amendment, but the 15th Amendment. And so you take those two amendments together. One was to be passed and then the other. And the 15th Amendment really is an opportunity to grow the party, to grow the Republican Party, because without a doubt, newly freed slaves were going to vote Republican given the opportunity. And so more Republicans, right? More Republicans in office, that and the power then rests with those individuals. So this is I don't know if this was the basis of the decision being made, but it certainly helped to push the issue, right? To grow the ranks and the strength of the Republican Party at the cost, of course, of the Democrat Party. And creating more Republican voters certainly happens because of the 14th and the 15th Amendment. So there's a lot to unpack there. Right now, currently going on is the question as to whether or not individuals who are not citizens of the United States should be counted. And this goes back to both Section 1 and Section 2, right? So that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject there are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So again, we're talking about persons. So a person who is born or naturalized is also a citizen, but we're still talking about persons. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges of immunity and citizenship, nor shall any state deprive any person, again, sticking with persons, life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Now, is this the type of person that is a citizen or not a citizen? Right? Was this meant to be individuals who were citizens also and not citizens in terms of their life, liberty, and property, due process of the law? Or deny any person, again, we're sticking with person here, within its jurisdiction, the equal protection of the laws. So this amendment is declaring who a citizen is, right? A citizen is a person who's born here. It's declaring that individual persons have rights, and that those rights cannot be abridged, and that the person must enjoy equal protection of those rights. Now, again, I believe that we're focused here on the persons being the newly freed slaves who, according to the past court decision, right, Taney's decision, stare decisis, the past court decision that blacks were not intended to be citizens. 14th Amendment has to be passed. This is how it's written. It has to be passed. And once it's passed, those individuals are citizens. So the issue regarding jurisdiction. What is jurisdiction? Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Is somebody who is from outside the United States here illegally subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? It's a good question, right? If I'm in your house, right, do I follow your rules? Do I have to follow your rules if I'm in your house? Can I follow my own rules? If I'm not invited into your house, is there an expectation I'll follow your rules? In other words, a burglar, someone who breaks into your house. Those are interesting questions to ask. And so whether or not, to get into context here and to truly get an understanding, you'd also want to take a look at the debates and the arguments and discussion that led up to the language that was the 14th Amendment and then its ultimate ratification. But currently, right now, the census is taking place. And so in the apportionment of representatives, the census will determine how many persons each state has. Whether those persons were meant to be counted in the census or not, that's the debate and the argument. And the Supreme Court just recently heard that argument. Section 3, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as any executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Okay, this is important. Here we have the cart and the horse. This is the cart, right? The cart is ahead of the horse. The horse is that the state legislatures have to pass this, right? The proper Article 5, if we follow the constitutional process for amending the Constitution, Article 5 says 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, we send it to the states. The state legislature, elected, Republican form of government, elected by their states, must adopt this. And it says that any individual who was who was basically worked against, taking the oath, but also worked against the Constitution, they can't hold office. What legislator is going to support this? Zero. Zero legislators are going to support this. So during this period of Reconstruction, the state legislatures that were duly elected and good enough to pass the 13th Amendment were removed from their position and replaced with provisional legislatures. And those provisional legislatures are the entities that ultimately passed this amendment. This is why it's unconstitutional. It's not that the language itself is bad language. It's not that, it's that its passage it didn't happen because the state legislatures would not, duly elected state legislatures, Republican form of government, never leaving the Constitution, good enough to pass the 13th Amendment, would never have passed the 14th Amendment. So they were removed, forcibly removed, and replaced with provisional governments that would pass the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Was it necessary? Well, necessary and constitutional are not necessarily the same thing, aren't the same thing, right? Right? So this is the argument where the 14th Amendment again becomes, its passage becomes unconstitutional. The piece that's in the piece that's in the sessions gives you a greater understanding beyond just this piece of provisional governments passing the constitutional amendment, including this regarding whether or not your state legislatures could hold office anymore any longer. So Section 4, then, the validity of public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payments of pensions and bounties for service in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but as such debts, obligation, and claims shall be held illegal and void. Okay, so again, property, due process of the law. You can make the argument, again, this 14th Amendment has not passed, that the 5th Amendment to the Constitution provided for takings, that when any individual somebody's property was taken, they must be justly compensated. Before they were denied their property, there would be the due process of the law would be afforded to them. And so that issue of slavery and debts is being washed out, if you will, with the Section 4 of this amendment. It still needs to be passed. And then Section 5, Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So Congress, not the courts, but Congress has the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Interesting that, again, when we look at the first equal protection of the laws, Congress never passed, and we apply it to, say, the Obergefell case or issues regarding gay marriage. Congress never passed any law that allowed for gay marriage itself, right? It wasn't Congress that was moving to say that this was not equal protection of the laws. That ultimately came about via the courts. Now, Congress never denied it either, but left it in the hands of the states. And then ultimately the courts came in and said, this is how we're going to interpret Section 1, and rewrote the laws of states. Not Congress, the courts. But at any rate, so that is your article, or excuse me, your 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It plays heavy in interpretations of the power of the federal government, particularly on issues of individual rights, beyond the idea of economics and state in dealing with foreign countries, which was really kind of the purview of the national government ahead of time. And then, this allows for the federal government to involve itself more in education beyond just the Commerce Clause. And, it really has, you take the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, you put those two together, and you have a federal government that can really do anything that it wants to, even with the Necessary and Proper Clause in that poor interpretation of Marshall early on. You still have a constitution that affords the federal government, with the willing courts, mind you, to do whatever it really chooses to do. And which is exactly, oddly enough, exactly what the South argued was the case. That the contract that they had entered into, which had the states maintaining certain rights that the national government wouldn't impose upon or involve itself in, the issue being, of course, slavery, but the southern states left, and the North saying, no, that's not how this works. We have a constitution, and that'll never happen. And that's exactly what's happened. You have the stage is set, the growth of the Republican Party through the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and then kind of a realignment through the progressive era of the political parties. And then, of course, with the Great Depression, another opportunity for a power grab with passage of a couple of other amendments, including the amendment regarding taxes on income, which is also, its passage is a little bit nefarious. And then the 17th Amendment, which deals with U.S. senators and electing U.S. senators versus the appointment by the state legislatures. And so that role of the state has really been winnowed down to being a tool of the national government. Right? National government says do these things, and then the states operate within that grand scheme. That's not a sharing of power, but really closer again to a unitary system than certainly than a confederal system, and even this federal relationship of shared power is not equal. Okay, all right, guys. So that takes us through the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. I ask you to read that piece. It's really kind of fascinating, even how the ratification of the Constitution, and whether or not they got the 3/4 of the states, even with the provisional governments in place for passage. A couple of states that were northern states, not southern states, northern states rescinded their support for the 14th Amendment before the 3/4 of the states got to pass it. And the argument is, well, we can't just allow states to say we disagree and then fall out of numbers. Once you agree, you agree. That doesn't make sense. That defies logic. Elections are held by elections are won and lost based upon the actions of the elected individuals. And those was it New Jersey and Ohio. And in fact, it was a congressman from Ohio who wrote the 14th Amendment in its introduction. Ohio changed its state legislature over this issue, and New Jersey as well. And then those newly elected Republican form of government legislators representing their state and their state's interests said, no, we don't think this 14th Amendment is the way we want to go. This looks like this may give too much power again to the national government, and we're opposed to it. Didn't matter. You already said yes. No takebacks, right? No takebacks, and the 14th Amendment was passed. Okay, so read that. I think you'll enjoy it. At least it's fascinating. Regardless, is the 14th Amendment settled law? I think its passage is settled, but I think its interpretation is not. And I think we see it again and again in the courts, depending on the makeup of the courts, right? Originalists versus activists, as to how they apply the 14th Amendment. Last thing we have to do is the final exam. And that's it. And that judicial paper, right? The judicial paper first and then the final exam. Hopefully you're already done with the judicial paper. But if not, get that done. Put your attention on that. Then the final exam. And we're done with the class. So go ahead and get that done. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me at williamsjkellogg.edu, and I'll answer what questions I can. So we're getting close to the end. There will be no more lectures. So this is it. If you have any questions, you'll need to email me. Have a good one, you guys. COVID 2020, let's get done with it.